In the back corner of a forgotten archive box, beneath layers of brittle newspaper and moth-eaten fabric, a photograph waited. It had been waiting for over a century. The image itself seemed unremarkable at first, a formal group portrait from 1910. The kind taken at institutions across America during an era when photography was still ceremonial, still sacred. 15 faces stared forward with the rigid composure expected of the time. Men in dark suits with high collars, women in long dresses with their hair pinned tight, children in their Sunday best, scrubbed clean and positioned like ornaments. Everyone looked directly at the camera, as people were instructed to do. Everyone except one. The photograph surfaced in 2004 during an estate sale in central Illinois. The house had belonged to a woman named Dorothy Hastings, retired schoolteacher who had spent her final years collecting local historical materials. Among her possessions were boxes of documents, letters, and photographs dating back to the 1880s. Most items were donated to the Springfield Historical Society. One volunteer, a woman named Catherine Mills, was sorting through the final box when she found a large format photograph mounted on deteriorating cardboard, its edges soft with age and handling. The image showed a group of people arranged in formal rows, their expressions stern and unchanging. But it was the inscription on the back that caught Catherine's attention. St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys. April 1910. Catherine had lived in Springfield her entire life. Yet she had never heard of St. Clement's. She made a note of it, cataloged the photograph, and added it to the digital archive. For years it sat there, one file among thousands, viewed occasionally by genealogy researchers and local history enthusiasts. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody looked closely enough. Then, in the autumn of 2011, Dr. Marion Kepler opened the file. Dr. Kepler was a retired photographic conservator who had spent 40 years restoring and analyzing historical images. She had worked with daguerreotypes, tintypes, glass plate negatives, and early silver gelatin prints. She understood the technical limitations of early photography, the exposure times, the chemistry, the careful staging required to capture a clear image. She had seen thousands of group portraits from the early 1900s, and she knew what they were supposed to look like. This one was wrong. Dr. Kepler zoomed in on the image, examining each face individually. The photograph had been taken outdoors, probably in a courtyard or open space with natural light. The subjects were arranged in 3 rows. Adults standing in the back, older children seated in chairs in the middle. Younger children sitting cross-legged on the ground in front. Everyone wore their formal clothing. Everyone stood or sat perfectly still, as they would have been instructed to do. In 1910, exposure times for outdoor photography still ranged from 2 to 5 seconds. Any movement would result in blur. Any break in composure would ruin the image. 14 people looked directly at the camera lens. Their gazes were level, their expressions controlled. But the 15th person, a boy standing near the right edge of the middle row, was different. His body faced forward, his posture was correct. But his head was turned sharply to the left, and his eyes were fixed on something beyond the frame. Not a casual glance, not a momentary distraction captured during the exposure. This was a sustained, deliberate stare, held long enough to be recorded with perfect clarity. Dr. Kepler saved the image and opened her measurement software. She drew lines from each person's pupils to the camera lens, confirming what her eye had already told her. 14 sight lines converged on the camera. One did not. The boy's gaze extended outward at approximately a 30-degree angle from the camera's position, aimed at a point somewhere to the left of the photographer. She sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. In all her years of studying historical photographs, she had never seen anything quite like this. Children in institutional portraits were trained to behave. Photographers would have corrected any deviation before opening the shutter. And yet this boy had been allowed or unable to maintain his misdirected gaze for the entire duration of the exposure. Dr. Kepler wrote an email to a colleague, Dr. Raymond Voss, a historian specializing in American child welfare institutions. She attached the photograph and asked a simple question. Have you ever seen this before? Dr. Voss replied within an hour. He had not. But he wanted to know more. Together, they began their investigation. Dr. Voss contacted the Springfield Historical Society and requested any additional materials. Related to St. Clement's? Industrial home for boys. What he received was, surprisingly, sparse a handful of administrative documents, a few newspaper clippings, and 2 other photographs. The institution had operated from 1887 to 1914, but very little of its history had been preserved. Most records, it seemed, had been lost or destroyed after the home's closure. But the photographs that did survive told their own story. In one image, dated 1909, a group of boys stood in work aprons outside a brick building. Most looked at the camera, but one boy in the back row stared downward, his shoulders hunched. In another, from 1912, a classroom scene showed children at desks. 3 boys in the front row sat with their heads bowed, their faces shadowed. And in the background of that same photograph, barely visible through an open doorway, stood the silhouette of a man. Dr. Voss arranged the photographs in chronological order and studied them carefully. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. In nearly every image, at least one child appeared anxious, withdrawn, or focused on something other than the camera. And in several photographs, the shadow or silhouette of an adult figure appeared just beyond the main frame. Dr. Kepler returned to the 1910 photograph and examined the boy's expression more closely. His face was pale, his jaw tight. His eyes were wide but not curious. They held the focused intensity of someone monitoring a threat. This was not the expression of a child distracted by something interesting. This was the expression of a child who needed to know where someone was. She measured the angle of his gaze again, this time projecting the line into the physical space where the photograph would have been taken. If the camera had been positioned at a typical height, roughly 5 feet off the ground, and the boy was standing approximately 15 feet away, then his sight line would have been aimed at a point roughly 8 to 10 feet to the left of the camera. At a height of about 5.5 to 6 feet, adult standing height, someone had been standing there. And this boy had not been able to take his eyes off them. Dr. Kepler printed the photograph and pinned it to the wall of her study. She looked at it every day for a week, and every day the same question returned. What were you looking at, Thomas? Because by then, they had found his name. Asterisk, the first breakthrough came from a handwritten enrollment ledger discovered in a storage room at the Illinois State Archives. The ledger belonged to St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys and covered the years 1907 to 1913. Each entry listed a boy's name, age, date of admission, and the name of the parent or guardian who had surrendered him to the institution. Some entries included additional notes, behavioral observations, medical conditions, reasons for placement. Dr. Voss found the April 1910 photograph referenced in a margin note. Group portrait commissioned. All residents and staff present. Below that, a list of names. The boy standing in the position matching the one in the photograph was listed as Thomas Wren. Age 9, admitted January 1908, with a name. The research accelerated. Dr. Voss requested birth and death records, census data, and any available school or medical files. What emerged was a brief, tragic outline of a childhood shaped by loss and instability. Thomas Wren was born in Springfield, Illinois, on March 14, 1901. His father, Edward Wren, was a railroad laborer who died in a switching accident when Thomas was 3 years old. His mother, Agnes Wren, worked as a seamstress, taking in piecework to support herself and her son. In the 1905 state census, they were listed as living in a boarding house on the south side of town. Sharing 2 rooms with another family, Agnes died of tuberculosis in November 1907. She was 31 years old. Thomas, at 6, had no other family. A probate court record noted that he was without means of support and ordered his placement at St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys, where he may receive Christian instruction and training in useful labor. He arrived at the home in January 1908. The intake record described him as small for his age, underweight, and quiet. A medical examination noted healing bruises on his back and arms, attributed to poor living conditions prior to admission. There was no follow-up for the next 5 years. Thomas lived at St. Clement's. He appeared in the institution's records only sporadically, a notation here, a disciplinary mark there. In March 1909, he was treated for a sprained wrist. In August 1910, he was noted as having missed several days of work duty due to illness. In January 1911, a teacher wrote in a report, "Thomas is obedient, but does not speak unless questioned. He watches others constantly and startles easily. Dr. Kepler forwarded these findings to a colleague, Dr. Elaine Moss, a clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and childhood development. Dr. Moss reviewed the descriptions and the photograph carefully. Her assessment was immediate and unambiguous. "This is hypervigilance," she said. "This child is monitoring his environment for threats. The way he's holding his body still, compliant, but with his attention locked elsewhere, that's a survival behavior. He's learned that safety depends on knowing where the danger is." Dr. Moss explained that children in abusive or neglectful environments often develop acute observational skills. They learn to read facial expressions, body language, and spatial positioning with extraordinary precision. They learn to track the movements of authority figures, to anticipate anger or violence before it happens. And they learn to do all of this while appearing outwardly calm and obedient. "In a photograph like this," Dr. Moss continued, "where everyone else is complying with the instruction to look at the camera, this boy's refusal to do so is significant. It suggests that whatever he was watching felt more important, more dangerous, than the social expectation to conform. He couldn't afford to look away." Dr. Voss returned to the photograph with this new understanding. He studied the boy's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the slight forward lean of his torso. Everything about Thomas's body language suggested alertness and readiness to react. This was not a distracted child. This was a frightened one. Dr. Kepler, meanwhile, continued her technical analysis. She contacted the Library of Congress and requested information about photographic equipment and practices used in institutional settings around 1910. What she learned confirmed her suspicions. Group portraits of this size and formality were typically taken using large format view cameras mounted on tripods. The photographer would compose the image carefully, ensure that all subjects were properly positioned, and then prepare the glass plate for exposure. Before opening the shutter, the photographer would call for everyone's attention, often using a phrase like, "Look here," or "Watch the camera." The exposure itself would last between 2 and 5 seconds, depending on lighting conditions. During that time, subjects were expected to remain absolutely still. Any movement, a turned head, a shifted foot, a blink would result in a blurred or ghostly image. Photographers often took multiple exposures to ensure at least one usable image. But in this photograph, Thomas was perfectly sharp. His face showed no motion blur. His features were clear and distinct. He had held his position and his gaze for the entire exposure. This was not an accident. This was intentional. Sustained attention directed at something outside the frame. Dr. Kepler used photogrammetry
software
to reconstruct the three-dimensional space of the photograph. She measured the distances between subjects, estimated the camera's focal length and position, and calculated the probable field of view. Then she extended Thomas's sight line into the reconstructed space. The line traveled outward from his eyes, past the edge of the frame, and terminated at a point approximately 8 feet to the left of the camera. At a height of 5 feet 9 inches, someone of average adult height standing in that position would have been clearly visible to Thomas but completely outside the camera's view. And based on the geometry of the scene, that person would have been standing very close to the photographer, perhaps. Just behind or beside the camera itself, Dr. Voss cross-referenced this finding with the enrollment ledger. The margin note from April 1910 listed all individuals present for the photograph. 12 boys, 2 female staff members identified as matrons, and 1 male staff member. The male staff member was listed by title only, Supervisor Finch. The name appeared again and again in the records Dr. Voss had gathered. Garrett Finch, disciplinary supervisor. Hired in 1905. Present at St. Clement's throughout Thomas Wren's entire residency. Dr. Voss began searching for information about Garrett Finch. What he found was a man who had left almost no personal trace and no marriage record. No property ownership, no children. But his professional presence at St. Clement's was undeniable. He appeared in budget reports, staff rosters, and incident logs. He was referenced in letters and testimonies, and in every mention, his role was the same: enforcer, disciplinarian, overseer of punishment. One letter, dated 1909 and written by a visiting minister, described Finch as a man of severe disposition, perhaps overly inclined toward the rod. Another, from 1911, written by a parent attempting to remove their child from the institution, stated, "My son returns home with marks I cannot explain and a fear I cannot comfort." No investigation had followed either letter. The institution's board of directors had reviewed the complaints and determined them to be unfounded or exaggerated. Finch had remained in his position, his authority unchallenged. Till the home closed in 1914, Dr. Kepler returned to the photograph one final time. She printed a large format version and marked Thomas's sightline with a thin red thread, stretching from his eyes to the edge of the frame. Then she marked the calculated position where Garrett Finch would have been standing. The thread pointed directly at him. St. Clements, Industrial. Home for Boys was located on the southern outskirts of Springfield, Illinois, on a plot of land that had once been farmland. The main building was a 3-story brick structure built in 1886. Designed in the utilitarian style, common to institutions of the Europlane, sturdy and imposing. 2 wings extended from the central hall, one for dormitories and one for workshops. Behind the main building stood a smaller outbuilding used for laundry and storage. And beyond that, a large open courtyard where boys assembled for exercise, work assignments, and occasional formal events. It was in this courtyard that the April 1910 photograph had been taken. Dr. Voss traveled to Springfield in the spring of 2012 to see the site in person. The building was still standing, though barely. The home had closed in 1914 under circumstances that remained unclear. The property had been sold to a private buyer, then resold several times over the decades. By the 1960s, it had been abandoned. By the 1980s, it was considered structurally unsound. Chain-link fencing surrounded the perimeter, and warning signs prohibited entry. Dr. Voss contacted the property owner and received permission to walk the grounds. He brought the 1910 photograph with him, along with architectural drawings he had obtained from the County Historical Society. Standing in the courtyard, he oriented himself using the building's layout and the position of the sun in the photograph. The camera would have been positioned facing north, the subjects arranged in rows in front of the dormitory wing entrance. He turned to his left. 8 feet away, at the approximate position indicated by Thomas Wren's gaze, was a doorway, a heavy wooden door with a transom window above it, leading into the dormitory wing. The door was now boarded shut, the wood rotted and splintering. But in 1910, it would have been the primary entrance and exit for the boys living in the home. Dr. Voss took several photographs of the site, noting the alignment of the doorway with Thomas's sightline. Then he returned to the archives to learn more about what had happened inside that building. The records he found painted a picture of an institution governed by rigid discipline and manual labor. Boys at St. Clements were expected to rise at 5:30 in the morning, attend chapel, eat a brief breakfast, and then report to work assignments that lasted until late afternoon. Younger boys worked in the laundry or kitchen. Older boys worked in the wood shop, the printing shop, or the farm fields that surrounded the property. Education was minimal basic literacy and arithmetic. Taught in the evenings after the day's labor was complete, discipline was enforced strictly. A rule book from 1908 listed dozens of infractions and their corresponding punishments. Speaking out of turn resulted in loss of meals. Failure to complete work resulted in additional labor. Disobedience resulted in corporal punishment, administered by the disciplinary supervisor. Asterisk, that supervisor, in 1910, was Garrett Finch. Finch had been hired in 1905. Shortly after the previous supervisor left under disputed circumstances, his background was in factory management. He had worked as a foreman at a textile mill in Peoria before taking the position at St. Clements. He had no formal training in education or child welfare. His qualifications, according to the hiring record, were experience in managing subordinate labor and a firm commitment to discipline and order. Within months of his arrival, complaints began to surface. A report from a visiting county inspector in 1906 noted that several boys showed signs of recent physical punishment, including bruises and welts. The inspector recommended review of disciplinary practices. The institution's director responded that such measures were necessary for the moral correction of delinquent youth, and declined to make changes. In 1907, a boy named Samuel Alcott was removed from the home by his grandmother, who reported that the child had become fearful and withdrawn and refused to speak about his experiences. In 1908, another boy, David Shore, was treated by a local physician for a broken rib. The injury was attributed to a fall during work duty. No further investigation occurred. By 1909. The pattern was undeniable, at least to those who were paying attention. A minister named Reverend Thomas Gaines, who visited the home monthly to lead chapel services, wrote a letter to the institution's board of directors, expressing concern about the atmosphere of fear that pervades the younger boys and the excessive reliance on physical correction. Specifically mentioned Garrett Finch, describing him as a man whose authority is maintained through intimidation rather than guidance. The board thanked Reverend Gaines for his concern and assured him that all staff members operated within the bounds of acceptable practice. No action was taken. Reverend Gaines stopped visiting the home shortly thereafter. In 1910, the year of the photograph, a boy named Peter Hollis died at St. Clement's. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning in a washing tub in the laundry building. He was 11 years old. An inquest was held, and several boys were questioned. Their testimonies were brief and identical. Peter had been working alone, slipped, and struck his head. No one had witnessed the accident. No one had heard him call for help. The inquest concluded that the death was accidental, and no further investigation was warranted. But a transcript of the proceedings preserved in county records included one exchange that stood out. A boy named Henry Marsh was asked if Peter had been afraid of anything at the home. Henry hesitated, then said, "We were all afraid." When asked to clarify, he said nothing more. Peter Hollis was buried in a pauper's grave at the edge of the county cemetery. His death was noted in the local newspaper in a single sentence. Garrett Finch remained in his position. And 3 months later, in April 1910, the group photograph was taken. Dr. Voss stood in the courtyard again, holding a printout of the photograph. He imagined the scene as it would have been that the boys assembled in rows, the photographer arranging his equipment, the staff members standing nearby, and somewhere just beyond the camera's view, in the doorway that led to the dormitories, Garrett Finch would have been watching. Thomas Wren had seen him. Thomas had known exactly where he was, and even as the photographer called for attention, even as the shutter opened and the seconds passed, Thomas could not bring himself to look away. Thomas Wren left St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys in March 1913 at the age of 12. The circumstances of his departure were not recorded in the institution's ledgers. There was no notation about a guardian claiming him, no transfer to another facility, no indication of where he went. He simply disappeared from the records. Dr. Voss found him again in the 1920 federal census. Thomas was listed as a 19-year-old laborer, boarding in a rooming house on the west side of Chicago. His occupation was listed as stock clerk. No family members were listed. No marital status was recorded. From there, the trail grew fainter. Thomas did not appear in the 1930 census. No marriage license was ever filed in his name. No property records, no military service records, no death certificate could be located in Illinois or neighboring states. It was as if after 1920, Thomas Wren had ceased to exist in any official capacity. Dr. Voss expanded his search, consulting city directories, employment records, and hospital admission logs. Finally, in a 1925 Chicago City directory, he found a listing: Wren Thomas, janitor residing 412 S. Halsted, St. The address was a tenement building in a working-class neighborhood near the stockyards. Fire insurance map from 1926 showed the building still standing. Dr. Voss contacted the Chicago Historical Society and requested any available information about the property. What he received was a brief note indicating that the building had been demolished in 1958. With no surviving resident records, but tucked into the file was a single newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune. Dated August 1927, it was a police blotter item. No more than 3 sentences long. Thomas Wren, 26, of S. Halsted, St., was treated at Cook County Hospital following a disturbance at his residence. Wren was found unconscious after neighbors reported sounds of a struggle. No charges were filed. Dr. Voss reached out to Cook County Hospital's archives department, hoping to locate admission records from that period. Most records from the 1920s had been destroyed or lost. but a sympathetic archivist agreed to search the remaining files. Weeks later, Dr. Voss received a scanned image of a handwritten admission log. Entry from August 14, 1927. The entry listed Thomas Wren, age 26, admitted with head trauma and contusions. The attending physician's notes described evidence of assault and patient unresponsive to questioning regarding circumstances of injury. Thomas had been discharged 3 days later. No follow-up visit was recorded. Dr. Voss shared these findings with Dr. Moss, the psychologist who had analyzed Thomas's behavior in the photograph. She reviewed the timeline carefully: childhood trauma at St. Clement's, a solitary adulthood, an unexplained violent incident, and then a complete disappearance from public records. This is consistent with long-term trauma response, Dr. Moss explained. Individuals who experience sustained abuse in childhood, particularly in institutional settings, often struggle with trust, relationships, and stability throughout their lives. They isolate themselves. They move frequently. They avoid systems and authority, and they rarely speak about what happened to them, because they've learned that speaking doesn't bring help, brings punishment. She paused, looking at the photograph of Thomas as a 9-year-old boy. Whatever he experienced at St. Clement's, she said quietly, it never left him. Dr. Voss returned to the institutional records. Searching for any additional mentions of Thomas during his years at the home, he found scattered references: a disciplinary note from 1909 stating that Thomas had been corrected for inattention during work duty, a medical log from 1910 recording treatment for a wrist injury, and a teacher's observation from 1911, describing Thomas as withdrawn and reluctant to engage with peers. But the most revealing entry came from a letter, written in 1912 by a woman named Edith Tremaine, one of the matrons employed at St. Clement's. The letter was addressed to the institution's director and concerned a request for additional staff supervision in the dormitories. In the letter, Mrs. Tremaine wrote, I have observed that several of the younger boys exhibit signs of distress during evening hours, particularly when Supervisor Finch conducts his rounds. One boy in particular, Thomas Wren, has been found on multiple occasions sitting awake long after lights out watching the door. When questioned, he claims he is not tired, but his fear is evident. The letter concluded with a request for a female staff member to be present during evening dormitory inspections. The request was denied due to budgetary constraints. Dr. Voss sat with this letter for a long time. He thought about Thomas Wren, at age 11, sitting in the dark, watching the door. He thought about the photograph taken a few months earlier, where Thomas had been unable to stop watching that same door, even when instructed to look elsewhere. And he thought about the man who had been standing there, the man whose presence had shaped Thomas's childhood and perhaps the rest of his life. Garrett Finch had remained at St. Clement's until the institution closed in 1914. After that, his trail was easier to follow. He appeared in the 1920 census as a resident of Springfield, employed as a factory supervisor. By 1930, he was listed as retired, living alone in a small house on the east side of town. He died in 1931 at the age of 63. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. His obituary in the Springfield Register described him as a dedicated servant to the moral education of wayward youth and noted that he had devoted many years to the betterment of boys in need of guidance. There was no mention of Thomas Wren in Garrett Finch's obituary. No mention of Peter Hollis or Samuel Alcott or any of the other boys who had passed through St. Clement's during Finch's tenure. The man was remembered, officially, as a pillar of discipline and moral instruction. But Thomas Wren had remembered him differently, and that memory, frozen in a single photograph, told a story that no obituary ever could. Dr. Kepler had reconstructed the geometry of the obituary's 1910 photograph with precision. The camera position, the arrangement of subjects, the angle of Thomas Wren's gaze, all of it had been measured, calculated, and verified. But knowing where Thomas had been looking was not the same as understanding what he had seen. To answer that question, Dr. Voss needed to reconstruct not just the physical space, but the social dynamics of that moment. Who had been present? What had been happening? And why had Thomas felt compelled to watch the doorway instead of the camera? He returned to the enrollment ledger in the margin, note from April 1910. The note listed everyone present for the photograph: 12 boys, 2 matrons, and 1 supervisor. The boys were named individually. The matrons were identified as Mrs. Tremaine and Mrs. Holcomb. The supervisor was listed simply as Supervisor Finch. Dr. Voss cross-referenced this list with other records from the same period. In April 1910, St. Clement's housed approximately 30 boys ranging in age from 7 to 15. The 12 boys selected for the photograph were likely chosen based on age, behavior, or appearance. Institutions often showcased their most presentable residents in promotional materials. Thomas Wren, at age 9, was among the youngest. He stood in the middle row, third from the right, positioned between an older boy and one of the matrons. His placement in the photograph suggested he was considered well-behaved, orderly, suitable for public representation. But his gaze told a different story. Dr. Voss obtained architectural blueprints of St. Clement's from the county archives. The blueprints, dated 1886, showed the original layout of the building. The courtyard where the photograph was taken was located directly behind the main hall. Bordered on three sides by the building's wings, the north side of the courtyard was open, leading to the farm fields beyond. The east side was the dormitory wing. The west side was the workshop wing. The south side was the main hall. The dormitory wing entrance, the door to ward, which Thomas had been staring at, was located on the east side of the courtyard, approximately 20 feet from where the subjects had been arranged. The door led to a corridor that ran the length of the wing, with dormitory rooms branching off on either side. At the end of the corridor was a small office used by the disciplinary supervisor, Garrett. Finch's office. Dr. Voss examined other photographs from St. Clement's. Looking for images that showed the same doorway, he found 3. In the first, dated 1909, a group of boys stood in work aprons outside the workshop building. The dormitory entrance was visible in the background, and in the shadows of the doorway stood a man's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, indistinct. In the second photograph, from 1911, the dormitory entrance was again visible, this time standing open. A figure could be seen just inside the corridor, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. In the third photograph, from 1912, the door was closed. But 2 boys in the foreground were turned slightly toward it, their expressions uneasy. Dr. Voss arranged all 4 photographs, 1909, 1910, 1911, and 1912 on his desk. In every image, the dormitory entrance was either visible or implied. And in every image, at least one child appeared to be aware of it, monitoring it, unable to ignore it. He shared these findings with Dr. Moss. "What does this tell you?" he asked. Dr. Moss studied the images carefully. "It tells me that the doorway itself had become a symbol of threat, not just the man who used it, but the space itself. Children in abusive environments learn to associate specific locations with danger. A particular room, a particular hallway, a particular door. And once that association is formed, they remain hypervigilant whenever they're near that space, even if the threat isn't immediately present." She pointed to the 1910 photograph. "Thomas isn't looking at Garrett Finch. He's looking at where Garrett Finch is standing. The doorway. Because that's where the danger comes from. That's where he's learned to watch." Dr. Voss returned to the testimonies collected during the 1913 inquest into Peter Hollis's death. The boys who had been questioned had mentioned the doorway multiple times. One boy, whose name was redacted in the transcript, stated, "We knew when he was standing there. We could feel it before we saw him." Another boy, asked to describe the daily routine at St. Clement's, mentioned that Supervisor Finch would appear without warning and that you had to be ready. A third boy, asked if he had been afraid at the home, replied, "Only at night, when the lamps were low and you heard the door." Dr. Voss found additional accounts and letters written by former residents years after leaving St. Clement's. One letter, dated 1923, and sent to a social reform organization in Chicago, described the writer's time at the home in stark terms. "We lived in a state of constant readiness. You learned to listen for footsteps. You learned to recognize the sound of his door opening. You learned to keep your head down and your mouth shut. And if you were called to the hallway after dark, you prayed someone would hear you." The letter was signed with initials only J.M. and no return address was provided. Another letter, dated 1930 and discovered in the papers of a minister who had advocated for child welfare reform, described similar experiences. The worst part was not the punishment itself, but the waiting. He would stand in the doorway and watch us. Sometimes for minutes. Sometimes longer. You never knew when he would move or who he would choose. So you watched him back. You had to. Dr. Voss compiled these accounts into a single document, organizing them chronologically and thematically. A pattern emerged. Boys describing a man who used presence and observation as tools of control. A man who rarely needed to speak because his silence was more frightening than his words. A man who understood that fear was most effective when it was sustained. Ambient, always hovering at the edge of awareness. And in the center of that fear was a doorway. The threshold between the dormitory and the courtyard. The space where authority crossed into the lives of children who had no power to resist. Thomas. Wren had been 9 years old when the photograph was taken. He had already been at St. Clement's for more than 2 years. He had already learned what the doorway meant. And on that April day in 1910, where the photographer called for attention and the shutter opened, Thomas had done what he had learned to do. He had watched the door, because that was where Garrett Finch was standing. Asterisk by late 2012. Dr. Voss and Dr. Kepler had assembled a comprehensive archive of materials related to St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys. Photographs, enrollment records, disciplinary logs, letters, newspaper clippings. And testimonies. Each piece added another detail to a picture that was becoming increasingly disturbing, but it was the photographs that held the most power. Unlike written records, which could be edited, destroyed, or reinterpreted, the photographs were fixed. They captured moments exactly as they had occurred, preserving details that no one had intended to document. Dr. Kepler returned to the digital archive and searched for every available image associated with St. Clement's. She found 9 photographs in total. Spanning the years 1905 to 1913, she downloaded each one, enlarged them, and examined them with the same analytical rigor she had applied to the 1910 group portrait. What she discovered confirmed their suspicions. In nearly every photograph, at least one child displayed body language consistent with fear or hypervigilance. Hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, faces turned slightly away from the camera, as if monitoring something in the periphery. But it was the background details that proved most revealing. In 5 of the 9 photographs, a male figure appeared, either partially or fully visible at the edge of the frame. In 3 cases, the figure stood in or near the dormitory entrance. In 1 case, the figure stood behind the photographer, visible only as a shadow cast across the subjects. And in 1 case, the figure stood directly beside the camera, his face turned toward the boys rather than the lens. That figure was Garrett Finch. Dr. Kepler created a side-by-side comparison of all 9 photographs, arranging them in chronological order. She annotated each image, marking the position of Finch, the body language of the children, and any visible signs of distress or discomfort. The pattern was undeniable. Garrett Finch had been present in the majority of formal photographs taken at St. Clement's during his tenure, and in each instance, at least one child, and often several children, showed physical signs of awareness of his presence. Dr. Voss took this analysis a step further. He obtained staff schedules and duty rosters from the institutional records, documenting when Finch had been on site and what responsibilities he had held. Finch's primary role was disciplinary enforcement, but his schedule showed that he had also been present during meals, work assignments, and evening dormitory inspections. He had access to the boys at all hours. He had authority over their daily lives, and he had operated with minimal oversight. The 2 matrons employed at St. Clement's, Mrs. Tremaine and Mrs. Holcomb, had been responsible for domestic tasks such as laundry, cooking, and basic medical care. They had limited authority and were not present during disciplinary actions or evening inspections. Several letters written by Mrs. Tremaine expressed concern about this lack of oversight, but her concerns had been dismissed by the institution's director, who maintained that the presence of a firm male authority is essential to the moral development of delinquent boys. Dr. Voss interviewed surviving relatives of former staff members, hoping to find someone who remembered Garrett Finch or could provide additional context. Most had no memory of the man, but one woman, the granddaughter of Mrs. Tremaine, recalled her grandmother speaking about her time at St. Clement's. She didn't talk about it often, the woman said, but I remember her saying once that she had worked at a boys' home where the children were always afraid. I asked her what they were afraid of, and she just shook her head. She said the wrong man had too much power, and no one would listen. Dr. Voss asked if Mrs. Tremaine had ever mentioned Garrett Finch by name. The woman thought for a moment, then nodded. She did. She said he was the kind of man who enjoyed having control over people who couldn't fight back. She said he never raised his voice, but the boys were terrified of him. Armed. With this testimony, Dr. Voss returned to the archival records and searched for any formal complaints or investigations. Related to Garrett Finch, he found 3 documented complaints filed between 1909 and 1912. The first, dated May 1909, was a letter from Reverend Thomas Gaines, the minister who had visited the home for chapel services. The letter described excessive use of physical correction and a pervasive atmosphere of fear among the younger boys. The letter specifically named Garrett Finch as the source of concern. The institution's board reviewed the complaint and concluded that Finch's methods, while strict, were within acceptable bounds for managing difficult children. The second complaint, dated March 1911, came from a parent who had removed their son from St. Clement's after noticing unexplained injuries and a refusal to speak about his experiences. The parent attempted to file a formal complaint with local authorities, but the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The boy's testimony was deemed unreliable, and Garrett Finch was not questioned. The third complaint, dated November 1912, was filed by a social worker who had visited the home as part of a state inspection. The social worker noted signs of malnutrition and physical abuse among several residents and recommended immediate investigation. The report was forwarded to the State Child Welfare Office, but no follow-up occurred. By the time the report reached the appropriate authorities, St. Clement's was already in the process of closing due to financial difficulties. Garrett Finch left the institution in 1914 without ever facing formal charges. He lived quietly in Springfield for the next 17 years, working in various supervisory roles at local factories. He attended church regularly. He maintained a reputation as a disciplined, upstanding citizen, and when he died in 1931, his obituary praised his dedication to the moral education of children. But the boys who had lived under his authority remembered him differently. Their memories, scattered across decades and geography, painted a portrait of a man who had wielded power with cruelty and precision. A man who had understood that silence and observation could be more terrifying than violence. A man who had stood in doorways and watched children with the knowledge that they could not escape, could not resist, could not speak. And in one photograph, taken on a spring day in 1910, a 9-year-old boy named Thomas Wren had looked directly at him. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Asterisk in the spring of 1913. A boy named Henry Marsh left St. Clement's Industrial Home for Boys at the age of 14. He had been a resident since 1907, one of the longest tenured boys at the institution. Unlike Thomas Wren, whose departure had been unrecorded, Henry's exit was documented. He was released into the custody of an uncle who lived in Decatur, Illinois, and who had agreed to provide him with work as a farm laborer. Henry Marsh lived a long life. He married, raised a family, and worked as a carpenter till his retirement in the 1960s. He died in 1981 at the age of 82. And in the final year of his life, he gave an interview to a local oral history project focused on early 20th century child welfare systems. Dr. Voss discovered the interview transcript in 2013. Archived at the Illinois State Historical Library. The interview had been conducted by a graduate student researching the history of reform schools. Henry had been one of several former residents contacted for the project. Most had declined to participate. Henry had agreed, on the condition that certain details be kept confidential until after his death. The transcript was made public in 1982. 1 year after Henry passed away, Dr. Voss read it carefully, and what he found confirmed everything he had suspected. Henry described his years at St. Clement's and measured his careful language. He spoke about the daily routine, the early mornings, the long hours of work, the minimal education, the strict rules. He described the food as inadequate and the living conditions as harsh but tolerable. And then, midway through the interview, he began to talk about Garrett Finch. "We all knew to stay out of his way," Henry said. "He didn't need a reason to single you out. Sometimes it was because you'd done something wrong. Sometimes it was just because he felt like it. He'd call you to his office after dark, and you'd go because you had no choice. And what happened there? Well, we didn't talk about it. We couldn't. The interviewer asked Henry to clarify what he meant. Henry hesitated, then continued. He hurt us. Not always in ways that left marks. He was smart about that. He knew how to make you afraid without giving you proof. And if you told anyone, he'd make sure you regretted it. A boy named Peter tried once. Told one of the matrons what was happening. A week later, Peter drowned. They called it an accident. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was a warning. Interviewer asked if Henry had ever reported his experiences to authorities. Henry shook his head. Who would I have told? The police. The director of the home? They all knew. They had to have known. But boys like us didn't matter. We were orphans, delinquents. Nobody cared what happened to us as long as we stayed quiet and stayed out of sight. Henry's testimony, recorded 70 years after the fact, was not enough to bring charges against Garrett Finch, who had been dead for 50 years. But it provided crucial corroboration of the patterns Dr. Voss and Dr. Kepler had identified. Dr. Voss searched for other testimonies. He contacted aging former residents through genealogy databases and public records. Most declined to speak, but 2 others agreed to brief phone conversations. The first, a man named Robert Keene, confirmed that Garrett Finch had been cruel and unpredictable, and that the boys who got called to his office often came back different. Robert refused to provide additional details, saying only that some things are better left buried. The second, a woman named Clara Daniels, had been the daughter of one of the kitchen staff at St. Clement's. She had been a child herself at the time, living in a small cottage on the property with her mother. She remembered seeing the boys during mealtimes and outdoor work periods. They were so quiet, she said. I remember thinking that was strange. Children are supposed to be loud, especially boys. But these children barely spoke, and they always seemed to be watching something. I asked my mother once why they were so nervous, and she told me not to ask questions. She said there were things at that place that decent people didn't talk about. Clara also remembered Garrett Finch. He scared me, she said, even though he never spoke to me directly. There was something about the way he looked at people, like he was deciding whether or not they were worth his time. My mother told me to stay away from him, and I did. Dr. Voss compiled these testimonies alongside the documentary evidence he had gathered: the photographs, the letters, the disciplinary records, the inquest transcripts. Together, they formed a portrait of systemic abuse, enabled by institutional indifference and protected by social hierarchies that valued authority over the welfare of vulnerable children. He also searched for records of any legal action taken against Garrett Finch during his lifetime. He found none. No criminal charges. No civil lawsuits. No disciplinary actions filed by employers or community organizations. Finch had lived and died as a respected, if unremarkable, citizen, but the evidence suggested a different truth. Garrett Finch had used his position at St. Clement's to harm children over a period of at least 9 years. He had done so with impunity, protected by the authority vested in him by the institution and by a society that refused to see or acknowledge the suffering of boys deemed unworthy of care. The crime that was never tried was not a single act of violence. It was a sustained campaign of cruelty, carried out in the shadows of a place meant to offer refuge and redemption. And the only record of it that survived was in the faces of the children who had lived through it, children like Thomas Wren, who had watched the doorway because he had learned that survival depended on knowing where the danger was. Asterisk. The photograph from April 1910 now hangs in a climate-controlled archive at the Illinois State Historical Society. Professionally restored, researchers can view it by appointment. Historians cite it in papers about institutional child welfare, but for Dr. Marion Kepler and Dr. Raymond Voss, the photograph will always mean something more. It is evidence. A silent testimony preserved by accident and chemistry. Dr. Kepler returned to the image one final time. She looked into the face of Thomas Wren, 9 years old, small for his age, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. This photograph had captured something unintentional: a child's fear, held in stillness for 3 long seconds, while the shutter remained open, because sometimes the most important part of an image is what's missing. The space just beyond the edge of the frame. The presence felt in every stiff shoulder, every averted glance. Every frozen face, Dr. Voss completed a comprehensive report documenting the institution's history and the pattern of abuse within its walls. The report gave names to the boys who had suffered there: Thomas Wren, Henry Marsh, Peter Hollis, and dozens of others. Thomas had looked at Garrett Finch that April day in 1910, not because he was brave, but because he was afraid. Because survival required him to always know where the danger was standing. The photograph is silent. But if you follow the boy's gaze, you can see what he saw, not in the image itself, but in the angle of his eyes. In the tension of his small, careful face, he saw a man who held power over his life, a man who could hurt him, silence him, control him. Thomas Wren could not escape. He could not fight. He could not speak, but he could watch. He could bear witness, and a century later, his testimony was finally heard. Dr. Kepler printed a final copy and wrote beneath it, "He saw, and now we do too, because the truth is always there, waiting. Sometimes in words, sometimes in records, and sometimes in the eyes of a child who could not look away."